You are watching the Deadfoot Diver Podcast with Curt, the Deadfoot Diver.
Welcome to the Deadfoot Diver Podcast. I am absolutely thrilled today to have a legend in the diving industry on, Dan Orr, who is the former head of Divers Alert Network. How's it going, Dan?
It's going pretty well. How are you doing?
Awesome. I am
Good.
so glad that you could join us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So let me start by telling me how you first got into scuba diving.
Well, I was born in Miami, Florida. My grandparents owned a home in the Florida Keys, and so I used to spend a lot of time down there with them. And one of their friends was a guy named Art McKee, who was the first treasure hunter in the Florida Keys.
Yeah.
And so Art used to come to these parties my grandparents had at their home. And I remember seeing Spanish treasure that he carried with him, and the fact that he used to tell all these tales, true or not, I'm not really sure, but tell all these tales about the things he'd seen underwater. And so I really wanted to get involved in scuba diving. And at the time, I was, of course, really young, and I did some snorkeling out there. And then it was kind of interesting, too. Every time I do some snorkeling there, everything that I saw on the bottom, of course, had to be a Spanish galleon or part of a Spanish galleon. And then what really, really turned me on, my parents actually took me to a drive-in theater once, and there was a movie called Underwater with Gilbert Roland, Richard Egan, and Jane Russell. And almost all of that film was filmed underwater. And it was in the 1950s. And I can remember laying on the grass right in front of this gigantic open-air drive-in theater screen. It was like the poor man's IMAX. And I felt as though I really was underwater with them, and that really sealed the deal for me. And then I moved to Central America, to Costa Rica for a short period of time with my grandparents, and then back to Miami. And then my parents moved to Ohio, and then finally they relented and allowed me to take scuba lessons. So my brother and I took scuba lessons and got certified in 1964.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. So then when did you decide that you wanted to actually make this a career? Because I mean, you've been in the diving industry for like over 50 years now.
Oh, yeah. Actually, at least I think this year is my 60th anniversary of being certified. And
Wow.
I got started diving. My brother and I would dive all around Ohio, and then I went into the military, went to the U.S. Navy, and I was in the Navy for a period of time, did a tour of duty in Vietnam, and then I came back and went to college, and then I got degrees, and after I got my bachelor's degree, I was doing volunteer work for a local dive store, a local instructor in West Carrollton, Ohio. And so one evening, my friend and I were waiting in the pool for him to show up because he worked during the day at a factory, and he would come home, do some exercise, and have dinner, and then go to the pool for these scuba courses he was teaching. Well, he didn't show up one night, and so we called his wife, and it turns out he had a heart attack and died. Wow. And so his wife came to me and this friend of mine who were the pool assistants and said, we've got these classes in the dive store, but we don't have any instructors. So would you guys like to become instructors? And I said, well, okay, what the heck? And then she said, well, I'll pay your way. And that was even better. And so she paid my way to a YMCA scuba instructor course down in Cincinnati. And so this friend of mine and I became scuba instructors through the YMCA. And there was a guy there from PADI also who certified us as PADI instructors. And so we then went to work for this dive store. And so while working at the dive store and still going to college, I found out the university that I was going to school at, which is Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, was going to build a pool. So I went to them and I said, I'd like to teach scuba diving for the university. And they said, well, I'm really sorry. We just hired somebody. And I said, well, who is this guy? I'd like to talk to him. Maybe I can help him out. So they gave me this guy's name. I went to talk to him. And he was an aquatics professional, whatever that means. And I said, tell me something about your diving experience. He said, well, I've never been diving in my life. And I said, but you're going to be teaching the scuba course here at the university. And they said, well, yeah, I'm an aquatics professional. I can do anything. And I said, well, no, not necessarily. So I said, well, I'm teaching a class for the dive store. I said, I'll get you in the class for free. You sit through the class. And then if you decide you really want to do that, I'll help you become an instructor. And then, I'll help you out in the scuba course at the university. Well, during the course, he realized it was something that was far beyond his capability. And he did get certified, by the way. But he said, no, I don't want to do that. So he went to the university and said, Dan needs to be teaching these courses. So I was able to set up the first scuba course at the university, which started in late 1973. And my only requirement from the university was leave me alone. Let me do the course the way I think the course needs to be done. And this was back, in the early 70s when there were basic standards, but you really could almost create your own course. And that's really what we did. Because after having been diving in Ohio for a while, I realized that some of the things that students were taught in some courses really needed to be a little bit more in depth, especially since I could be diving in limited visibility and quarries and cold water necessarily. So we created basically our own courses, and that included an entire curriculum. In fact, after about 15 years of teaching there, we had probably almost 20 different courses that we offered in scuba diving, and we had an entry level course. We had a course that was between entry level and advanced that I called Experienced Open Water Diver, because I thought there needed to be something between the entry level and an advanced course. And so that was about 25 additional open water dives, and then river diving and night diving and all this stuff. And then I developed an advanced course, which we called it our advanced research course, which really was more of a research diver program, because there were a lot of projects the students were involved in, including going up to Tobermory to dive the shipwrecks up there, because I wanted them to understand something about underwater archaeology. And the Arabia, which is the wreck we dived on most frequently, was a perfect candidate for doing underwater archaeology. And then did that for 15 years, and then I was recruited to go to Florida State. I was the associate dive safety officer down there and the instructional coordinator, so I taught all the scuba courses and also taught some of the scientific diving courses, and we did a lot of work for the different departments at Florida State: marine biology, oceanography, hydrology, water. Their departments that had to do with water quality, and a lot of others. So anytime anybody needed something that was in or under the water, they would come to us. And did that for a few years, and then I went to North Carolina and became the training coordinator for Divers Alert Network. I was the training director, and then went from there to other things as the organization grew. Because one of my first jobs was to create the Dan Oxygen program, which I did, and the oxygen units and the things that go along with that. And then after the organization started growing, since I tend to, if I see something I think needs to be done, I just go ahead and do it. So there were things going on there that I just went ahead and did because I thought they needed to be done as the organization grew. And I became the operations director, and then ultimately the executive vice president and chief operating officer. And then ultimately I became the president of the organization, then retired from there in 2013 and moved out to the great state of Idaho, where it's snowing right now, and continue to do a lot of volunteer work. Because I do volunteer work. I'm the chairman of the board of DEMA, the Diving Equipment and Marketing Association, chairman of the board of Force Blue, a veterans organization that deals with special operations veterans, chairman of the board of Best Publishing and WCH Media Corporation, and then the president of the Academy of Underwater Arts and Sciences that gives out the annual NOGI Award.
Wow.
And, yeah, then I do writing now for Scuba Diving Industry Magazine, and do webinars regularly on diving safety topics, and lead trips for a company called Blue Green Expeditions out of Oregon. Just got back from Cuba, as a matter of fact, from one of the expeditions they did.
How was your Cuba trip, actually?
Cuba trip was really good. It was a little chilly when we first got down there because the air temperature was in the upper 50s. Then they had a real strong wind blowing, so it brought the wind chill factor down a little bit. But the water temperature was 82 degrees, and we spent a week in Havana. We always do a land package as part of what we do with this Cuba trips, and then we did a week on the Jardines Aggressor 2 in the Gardens of the Queen. It was really, really good. So a lot of sharks and Goliath grouper and turtles and a lot of reef fish. It was really, really good. Had a good time.
Awesome. Hey, while we're on that topic, when you're down there, have you noticed over the last couple of years a reduction in marine wildlife from global warming?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I was there 2 years ago. I led an expedition that I do the diving portion. Faith Ortiz, who runs Blue Green Expeditions, does the land portion. And so 2 years ago when I was there, we saw a lot of coral, a lot of healthy coral, so a lot of stands of pillar coral. This year, there was no living pillar coral that we saw. Because this past summer, the water temperature got up to 99 degrees. Yeah.
99 degrees.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And we did see a little bit of coral bleaching with the other corals, but I didn't see any damage to the brain coral, didn't see any damage to the plate coral that was there. I didn't see any elkhorn or staghorn coral in the places we went. But it didn't appear the marine life had suffered at all. Because we saw a lot of sharks, saw a number of big Goliath grouper, including one called Lola, who's a kind of a favorite Goliath grouper who follows you around because she thinks if you're looking at something, it might be a food source for her. And so, yeah, and so we saw a lot of really healthy reef fish. So the fish population didn't seem to be affected, at least from what I saw the last time I was there.
Wow, that's really good because I know I was in Jamaica a while ago, last month, and I was actually shocked at how little of fish and marine life we've seen compared to other times I've been diving. And in fact, one of the guys who's coming on my podcast, Barry Middleton, who's a British motorcycle champion, I was diving with him all week, and he's dove there a bunch of times, and he was even shocked at the lack of marine life compared to when he's dove there previously. Even lionfish, he said there was not near as many lionfish as what you'd normally see.
Yeah, we didn't see very many lionfish at all. When I talked to the marine biologist that was there, they came out to visit our boat one day. He was saying that the reason is that the lionfish evidently have learned, or excuse me, the sharks and groupers have learned that the lionfish are a food source. So that's good. Yeah, that's good.
That's a good thing then.
Yeah, I think so.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Deadfoot Diver. Subscribe and share. Your support means the world to me. If you'd like to contribute directly, you can do so at the link in the description at buymeacoffee.com/deadfootdiver. Every donation helps me work towards earning my Adaptive Dive Buddy certification, travel costs to help me assist other adaptive divers, and covering further training and equipment costs, bringing you on even more exciting adventures. Don't forget to check out my guest links in the description. And remember, grab an adventure and live. So tell me, in all your time in Dan, what were some of the other major protocols and things that you've implemented that we still use today as far as dive emergency preparedness and stuff? Because, I mean, when you started, there probably was basically no framework at all, hardly.
Well, because Dan actually started in 1980, it was actually something that was created through a joint effort of the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society and NOAA and a few other groups who were looking to find a civilian hotline somewhere in the United States. Because prior to that time, scuba instructors like myself, if we needed to find out where the nearest chamber was, we had to call the U.S. Air Force. We called Brooks Air Force Base. It was called the Leo Fast number. Because the Air Force had a lot of chambers all over the world. Almost every Air Force base has a chamber because pilots get the bends like divers do. And so we would call them, and we'd also sometimes call the supervisor of diving. And they got, I think, kind of tired of us calling, not only to find out where the chambers were, because we had to put together these sort of elaborate emergency assistance plans to know where to take somebody if somebody was injured. But also, occasionally we ask questions, about, what's going on, if I've got this symptom, what do I do, or this or that, or all kinds of questions about diving. And so they really didn't want to answer those questions anymore because it's taking a lot of their time and resources. So they started looking around for a place to have a civilian hotline. And they ultimately selected Duke University Medical Center because it had one of the largest chamber complexes in the world. And at the time, Dr. Peter Bennett was the director of the hyperbaric facility there. So he became the director of Dan in the very, very beginning. And so he was the one that managed Dan and got everything going. He started hiring employees. And so that's when it started growing. And then when I came on board, which is 1991, they wanted to start some training programs because they felt that not only was Dan doing good things about having an emergency line that you could call not only to help an emergency but also for information, but there were people who didn't know how to use oxygen equipment to treat diving emergent injuries actually from a first aid perspective. So that was my job to do that. And so then as I kind of worked my way up, Dan started expanding, started doing more and more things. And that's when we got involved in doing research meetings, research projects, training physicians in diving medicine. did things, for example, like the flying after diving studies. And the flying after diving studies was because there needed to be some sort of protocol on what you did if you either flew or actually even went to altitude. Because there were a lot of people in North Carolina, for example, that dive at the coast, and then they'll drive home to West Virginia or Ohio or Tennessee or wherever and go over the mountains. And of course,
Never even thought about that.
yeah, these people would start getting symptoms when they got to the top of some of these mountains. And so people were getting symptoms following this exposure to depth and also sudden going to altitude. So Dan did those kind of projects, and that's something that was really very, very important at the time. We also did something that was called Project Dive Exploration, where we were looking at incidents of injury, because one of the things that we would always tell people is that diving is safe. And in my opinion, diving is a safe sport. It's inherently safe. There's nothing really about it that is inherently dangerous. But we would go and tell people that, and they say, okay, fine, well, prove it. Well, the problem is you can't prove it unless you have an instance of injury. And to have an instance of injury, you have to have a denominator number, which is the number of safe dives that are done. Nobody knows that. There's no way in the world for anybody to collect that kind of information. We have a good feeling that there are millions and millions of safe dives done every year without incident. And then there are, of course, incidents that occur, 1,000 or so cases of decompression sickness or air embolism that happen every year. So what we decided to do at Dan was to start a project where we actually looked at the number of safe dives that were done and any injuries related to those safe dives. So we sent interns all over the world to collect data. What they did, they collected data by downloading dive profiles from dive computers. And then following that diver post-dive and then post-trip to see if there were any injuries related to the dives that person had made. And so what we were able to do then was to come up with a true instance of injury, because we knew how many dives were done, we knew how many injuries there were related to those dives. And so the instance of injury ranged from 1 per 10,000 water dives for people diving on liveaboards, because liveaboards, you have people there that are there just for your safety, to give you all the information you have to make the decisions you and your diving partners have to make the decisions you need during the dive for your safety and your enjoyment of the dive. And so 1 out of 10,000 water dives was what we would sort of consider the safe baseline. And then they also looked at people who were involved in diver training, like dive professionals, instructors or assistant instructors. Then we looked at people who were doing dives from their own personal watercraft, like their own boat or whatever from shorelines, that didn't have people that were there telling them all the information they needed to have. So they needed to do the information or gather the information on their own. And then we also looked at people who were doing what we would call technical diving now. And so their incidence of injury was much higher because of the fact they were doing very aggressive diving, really pushing the edges of that envelope. And so the risk was higher. And of course, out of all this, then people learned to mitigate some of those risks by using different gas mixtures and different algorithms, different dive profiles, and those kind of things. So the incidence of injury ranged from 1 per 10,000 water dives to 23 per 10,000 water dives for people who were doing technical diving. But again, if we did it again, since people know a lot more now about how to mitigate those risks, then those numbers are likely to be even a little bit lower. So that's one of the things we did. We also did workshops on diabetes and diving. We did workshops on multi-level dive profiles. We did on repetitive dive profiles and reverse dive profiles and a lot of other things on fatalities and fatality research and flying after diving. And I mean, just a lot of things. So there were a lot of things that we did during the time that I was there, which weren't necessarily things that I did myself because I simply was involved in those things. But we had a fantastic research team and medical team that were doing all of those research projects and getting involved in those research projects and publishing all that data, publishing all that information, and distributing the information through the Alert Diver magazine.
Yeah, which is amazing. I mean, one thing, I started diving again this year after being absent from it for 25 years.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. It has literally changed my life. I mean, being a disabled person and scuba diving is giving me my life back. There's no other way around it.
Good. That's good. And we actually, when I worked at the university in Ohio, Wright State University, it was a new school. It actually at one time was a branch campus between Ohio State and Miami universities. And it was created to be accessible by everybody. So regardless of any disability or ability you had, it was accessible. So when I was going to school there as a student, I mean, almost every class I took, there was a disabled student in that class. So when I first started the scuba course there, it wasn't odd to me that there were disabled students that wanted to take scuba diving. And the problem was, and again, that was in the early 70s, there weren't any standards or training programs or protocols for training people with disabilities. And so what we had to do is we had to sort of do it ourselves. And so when somebody would show up in my class, in a chair, for example, wheelchair, or somebody with an amputation or something with some other disability, then we would sit down with them and first of all evaluate them from the perspective of their abilities. What could they do, first of all, rather than starting with their disability? What could they do? And then how we would modify whatever the standards happen to be so they could learn to scuba dive, and not only learn to scuba dive, but be certified and be a safe, competent diver in a variety of conditions. And again, we were training people to dive in quarries and rivers and some difficult conditions. So we had to make sure that they could do all that stuff. And so it wasn't unusual for us to start certifying paraplegics or amputees or people with other disabilities in those scuba courses.
Which is amazing, because I mean, a lot of, even today, there's not a lot of overall training available for people with disabilities for scuba diving, from what I've been finding. I mean, there's Dive Heart in the States and a few other organizations. Canada, very limited on my options as far as a disabled training instructor. There's actually one instructor here that's 6 hours away from me, and who also teaches technical diving for adaptive divers. And he can't take any students. He's swamped. He's got a set amount of students he works with. I'm actually going to train as an ed buddy so I can help some of these guys, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah.
That's going to be awesome for me as well, because I mean, not only that, he's got a paraplegic that's actually cave diving.
Nice.
I mean, it's going to open up a lot of doors for me diving wise that I never even imagined possible. Because when I first started diving, I was like, okay, well, yeah, I want to do some technical diving maybe and stuff like that, but no overhead, obviously, because of my disabilities. And I wasn't going to do any cave or wreck penetration because of that as well. And now those doors have opened for me because I have an instructor that I'm confident enough to dive with and actually try some of that stuff.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, good for you. Good for you.
Thanks. I'm really looking forward to it.
Nice.
So what have you seen as far as working with people with disabilities and how diving has changed their lives?
Oh, it made a dramatic change. In fact, one of the students that I had was a guy who had worked in the coal mines in West Virginia. And his job was to operate a truck that pulled coal cars out of a mine. And when this truck was designed, it was designed with a cage around the top of it to protect him from things that were falling down from the ceiling. Well, evidently, the company he worked for had removed that cage because it either got in the way or there was some problem with it. I'm not sure of the details. But as he was pulling these coal cars through this cage or this mine, and this thing was, it only had start and stop. It didn't have any way to control the speed. And so evidently, as he was coming out of the coal mine, there had been a cave-in in front of him, a small cave-in or collapse of the ceiling. And so this coal car that he was driving went up the incline and crushed him against the ceiling, which damaged his spine. And so he became a paraplegic. Well, he came to me and wanted to know if he could get certified because he had always wanted to be a diver. And I said, well, we'll do what we can. And so we put him through the training program. He did become certified, and he actually had quite a bit of money because of the legal case that he brought against this company. And so he traveled all over the world. And so he would send me postcards for a long time about all these places he'd gone. So it really was a major, major change in his life. And then we had other students who also had disabilities. And I can remember probably one of the most emotional things was a student that we had taken, he'd gotten certified. We took him out to do his open water dives. And when he got in the open water for the first time, as I looked at him when we went underwater, there were tears in his eyes. Because he was free. He was free. He was free of the chair and not in a pool. He was outside in the open water, and it really made a significant difference in his life. And we had one student. There was one student who had a brain injury that we dealt with. He actually had been in a car accident, and it damaged his brainstem and wiped out his short-term memory. And he had been a certified diver beforehand, but his parents came to me and said, I'd like to get him back into the sport because he really misses diving, but he has no short-term memory. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, we've never dealt with anybody with a short-term memory problem before, but we'll see what we can do. And I said, I went to the administration of the university and I said, I've got this young man who really wants to be certified, and it's probably going to take us more than one course to kind of get him through to the point where he can really function as a certified diver. And so the university said, fine, they won't charge him any additional amount of money. And so we got him in the course. And it took three courses back to back to back. To the point where he started actually remembering things and that he could function effectively and safely as a certified diver, doing dive tables and everything else. And we finally were able to recertify him as a diver. But I'll tell you, he was a great young man. But the first thing he learned after going through these three courses were the punchlines to my jokes. Because when you teach the same course over and over again, you tend to use the same jokes over and over again. And this young man, his name was Steve, he learned the punchline of my jokes, and so I'd get ready to give the punchline, and he would blurt it out. So I had to I'd say, Steve, I want to keep you in the course. Just don't give my punchlines away. We saw so many changes in people's lives once they become certified and were free of the chair.
Yeah, it's amazing, the benefits of it, both mentally and physically.
Yeah.
I have no movement below my left knee, and then I'm blind in my left eye. And on top of it, my right side is actually from another motocross accident. It's actually pinned and plated really heavy too. So I'm pretty restricted on movement that way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely not doing any running or jogging anymore.
I don't blame you. I don't do it either.
And not only that, I'm clumsy. So I mean, case in point right there, right?
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, it's definitely amazing for me, especially because, I'm under the water. I'm not clumsy. I am actually free. And best of all, I am actually a lot less pain after I'm diving.
That's good.
Oh, it's amazing. I noticed this summer, just from doing dives 2 or 3 times a week, the difference in my pain level, which is
good.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's good.
So, yeah.
Yeah, scuba diving is very therapeutic for people with a lot of different things to deal with. I know when I'm on the board of directors for this veterans group called Force Blue, we deal with a lot of special operations veterans, the Navy SEALs and Special Boat Service of the UK and a lot of others, Army Rangers. And so all these people were trained to dive in the military, but after coming back to the military, especially war zones, they have PTSD to deal with. And so we're hoping, and we are seeing some benefit of the scuba diving activities because we give them projects to get involved in, divide them into teams and give them projects to be involved in that are helping the marine environment, for one thing. So they are doing good, as well as getting some benefit from that exposure to the ocean having to do with their PTSD.
Yeah, I've actually heard that from a lot of guys, of the benefits that they've had from PTSD just from scuba diving, which is awesome. So yeah, that's
Good.
definitely a good benefit of diving for sure.